Greetings, everyone. Welcome back. Today I'm going to talk a little bit more about training in Christianity, and maybe some folks will chime in for a discussion. Only have a few subscribers at this point, so I'm not expecting that. But in any event, I am a Kierkegaard nerd and spend my free time reading his work, and so I figured that why not share my thoughts with all of you. So here goes. Last time I was talking a little bit about inwardness and how that applies to Kierkegaard's feelings, and the fact that the Christian journey is one of inwardness. It has nothing to do with who we associate with, what we are taught about Christianity. It is something that has to happen from within. And so there were a couple of things that I wanted to include in my last video, which I did not. So here goes. I did talk a little bit about the fact that Kierkegaard places the individual above the broader society, and that in a way is an outgrowth of the Christian faith, because the Christian faith posits that Christ is the unity of God and one individual man, rather than God and all men, all mankind. That was a kind of a new idea, a controversial idea, and it's still something that people naturally take a certain offense to and are taken aback by. And Kierkegaard says that that's perfectly natural, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, hopefully, if I remember going forward, because I think that's a really important idea that needs to be discussed when talking about Kierkegaard, is the idea that part of the Christian journey is taking a step back, and then we go from there, which I'll share more about. So if you do not take this inward journey and experience discernment for yourself about what is right and wrong for you according to what God reveals to you, then you run the risk of kind of relying on the ethics of society to guide you, which is a much easier journey. And that's one reason why perhaps the Christian message, according to Kierkegaard, is one that people are taken aback by, because that's the journey of journeys. That's the hero's journey, essentially, to go within yourself and become conscious of your ideal self and what you could be. And as soon as you do that, you become conscious of where you have missed the mark. And this is the consciousness of sin, if we're going to use religious language. And Kierkegaard says the consciousness of sin is another one of these guideposts for what it means to be a Christian. In my last video and in this one already, I've talked about the notion that Christ is the unity of God and one individual man. So that's one of these guideposts, and so another is most certainly the consciousness of sin for Kierkegaard. When we take this inward journey, it means that we are always transforming or striving to transform. And as soon as we become complacent, in a sense, our hearts kind of harden. And that's never what we want to do on the Christian journey. We always want to be in transformation. And the Christian heart is one, and I say Christian heart, but I'm not saying that from fundamentalist terms. I'm saying that from my perspective as a person of faith, the way that we always want to be, regardless of our faith choice, is that our hearts are always malleable, that they are always in transformation, and that we never become complacent with where we are. This is not something that I necessarily always do well, but I'm conscious of that. So Kierkegaard would say that I'm conscious of my own sin, and therefore there's hope for becoming closer to the ideal self for me. But we always want to be in transformation, and I think Kierkegaard would say that this does apply to society as a whole, but it more so applies to the individual. That there can be these revolutionary ideas. If we apply this to society, there can be a revolutionary idea that's completely new and controversial. And once it becomes accepted by the broader society and it becomes part of the ethical fabric of the society, it kind of runs the risk of hardening. And when an ethic kind of hardens, something that was once new, stops transforming, it then can become a weapon, I would say. It hardens. And an example I would give is, when a church stops transforming, when a church stops living and breathing and having a flexible heart, so to speak, then it becomes an environment where scapegoating can occur, where there are insiders and there are outsiders. And that's never what Kierkegaard would say we should ever allow to happen to ourselves or our society. People are afraid of this. They're afraid of being governed by themselves. In a sense, they want to be enslaved by what other people tell them is right and wrong, by the ethics of the broader society, because that is much safer than your own discernment, which is a much more dangerous process. Another thing that I want to talk about is how, in a way, the Christian heart is always mysterious. And Kierkegaard argues very strongly that Christ is a mystery and must always remain a mystery. The second that Christ becomes known or an historical figure only, then the mystery is lost, and so is faith. So an interesting idea that has been presented to me when I have studied Genesis is the idea of the Adam and Eve story, and how God is presented in the Adam and Eve story as kind of a mystery, and what is divine is presented as a mystery. And it's the serpent who comes in and presents the idea of certainty. And so I think within, the gospel and within the Old and New Testament, there's this idea that the one true God is a mystery, and always has to be a mystery, in the sense that we can never really grasp God. We can never, create an idol and worship at that idol and say that this idol contains God, because God is in everything. God was, and I don't think that's a contradiction from what I said earlier, that Christ manifested as one individual human being, but God itself cannot be contained in an idol, and so this is why Kierkegaard says that Christian apologetics, doesn't quite work, because there are these people who, they go to universities or churches, and their mission is to prove the resurrection or prove that these miracles happened, and use kind of what we have learned from history about Christ, or what they say we've learned from history about Christ, to prove the gospel message. And for Kierkegaard, that is just a blatant blasphemy, because you're taking what is supposed to be faith and you're turning it into an idol, essentially. You're making it something that is concrete, that people can grasp. And the Christian message is never supposed to be comprehended the way anything from history is supposed to be comprehended, or anything at all is supposed to be comprehended. The Christian message is supposed to be believed. Faith is supposed to be applied to it, not knowledge. And so I find that very interesting, because we do live in an age where there are many Christian apologists, and Kierkegaard would definitely take issue with Christian apologists. Because the second that we start to try to prove that certain miracles happened, it's to kind of turn it into a superstition, in a sense. And that's what the serpent, I think, introduces in Genesis, is superstition, which is in opposition to mystery, which is God. I talked a little bit about consciousness of sin, and I think, that sounds like very religious language. But again, I think what Kierkegaard is trying to say is that when we go deep within ourselves and we start to understand what our ideal selves are in relation to God, that's when we become aware of where we fall short, where we can improve, the fact that we're not perfect. And it's much easier to rely on the external world to inform us about the state that we're in. And so it's a much easier path to do that. And it's a much more difficult path to go within. And I think the way that this manifests in the Christian message for Kierkegaard is, first of all, as I said in the last video, about contemporaneousness with Christ, understanding that what it means really to be a Christian is to be an outsider in the same way that Christ's followers were outsiders. In order to be a Christian, you have to understand the controversy that goes with being a Christian. And it has to do with the lowliness of Christ. The fact that it is seemingly insane or absurd for essentially a homeless man to claim to be God. And if society sees anything as more insane than that, it's people who follow that homeless man who claims to be God. And so, society is always looking at what can be done for them in a material sense. And Christ has nothing to offer anyone in a material sense. The treasures of Christ are the treasures of the Spirit. And so it appears insane to the world at large. And as Christianity has become domesticated over many, many years, that scandal or that controversy has been taken out of Christianity. And so that was true in Kierkegaard's Denmark, and it's true today, I think. It's true in different ways. There's a disparity between the lack of understanding of true Christianity in 19th century Denmark with 21st century America, but that's for another video, I think. But the Christian message, Kierkegaard says, is something that causes people to be kind of taken aback. So he, again and again, he provides us with the image of this lowly man calling out, "Come hither to me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And clearly, he says that it's natural for a human being to kind of recoil from that and take a step back. And there has to be that experience for someone to truly become a Christian, to finally decide to be drawn to that individual and embrace that individual and love that individual. And if there hasn't been that moment of discernment where you discover this thing that appears to be something to recoil from, and then you've made that transition to embracing what the world sees as ludicrous, then you really can't have fully undergone the transformation that is required to be a person of faith in the truest sense. And that's Kierkegaard's point of view. I've always kind of seen this as tied in with the most famous idea of Kierkegaard's, which is the leap of faith. And the leap of faith has to do with making decisions, decision making. What kind of defines Kierkegaard among many philosophers or many religious ideas is that science and technology or rationality cannot teach us how to make decisions. Only faith can guide us as we make decisions. And every decision that we make is a leap of faith. It's not something that can be calculated in a temporal way. It's something that happens within our spirit, every decision that we make. And so essentially that is the leap of faith. Every time we step out into the unknown and make a decision. And that is what we always should be doing, according to Kierkegaard. And that's the same idea as I was putting forth earlier, that we should always be in transformation. We should always be stepping out into the unknown based on the best evidence we have and making decisions so that we always remain in transformation. But I think that this idea of recoiling from Christ is kind of tied in with the leap of faith, because I think that in a way, every time we make a decision, every time we step out in faith, there is that moment of discernment where we realize our decision wasn't our romantic idea of what the outcome would be. And in a sense, I think for Kierkegaard, that's when we kind of spin in the air, kind of helplessly. And that's the moment of being taken aback by Christ. That moment of uncertainty. And so we kind of spin helplessly. And I think that's what Kierkegaard would refer to as well as infinite resignation. So it's kind of like when we are children, and then we have that kind of Garden of Eden moment where we become adolescent and we become conscious of our own sin. We become conscious of our nakedness. And teenagers, I think, are in this period of infinite resignation often, where they kind of spin helplessly. And it's not until we kind of integrate our will, that step that we took out in faith based on our own will with the will of God, that we kind of land safely on the ground. So, adolescents kind of are in that moment of the leap where you're in the air spinning and there's this uncertainty and you kind of blame everyone but yourself for your circumstances, and you realize that your hopes and dreams perhaps aren't going to play out exactly the way you want them to. And it's not until you kind of make peace with your circumstances and embrace the position that God has put you in, and again, kind of fuse your will with the will of God, that you can kind of land safely on 2 feet. I hope that made sense, because it's something that I've thought about a great deal, and I hope that you have enjoyed this video. That's about all I can say for now on this subject. And thank you for watching, and thank you for your patience. My writing is a bit more fluid than my speaking, but that's one of the reasons why I wanted to make these videos. So thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to the next one. God bless.